Hello, and thank you for joining us. Welcome from me, Michael Scott from the UK, and from my joint convener, Sanford J. Unger in Washington, DC, to the 19th jointly promoted event between the Future of the Humanities Project and the Free Speech Project. The latter is sponsored by Georgetown University and the former by Georgetown's Humanities Initiative in association with Campion Hall, Oxford, and the Las Casas Institute for Human Dignity, Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. Together, the two projects consider issues concerning human dignity, rights, cultures, histories, traditions, and freedoms in a wide spectrum of educational activity, policy, expression, and aspiration. In a moment, I'll hand over to Sandy, who's the director of the Free Speech Project. He will introduce today's distinguished panels that come from right across the world, I'm pleased to say, and he will moderate the ensuing discussion before I return to chair the question and answer session. From the start, you can type in your questions to the panel by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A button, not the chat button. These questions will come to me during the session and I will try to put them to the panel to consider in the last 20 minutes or so. We urge you to ask questions and I will try to put them, as many of them as I can, to the panel and to Sandy later on. So with that, enjoy the debate and I'll be back with you later. Over to you, Sandy.
Thank you, Mike. Good morning to everyone. Or sorry, it's morning in Washington, but a late night in Bangkok, where Gwen Robinson is joining us from the Nikkei Asian Review. She is also associated with Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok. And thank you, Gwen. I know it was a tough thing for you to get from the airport, etc., today to join us. We also are delighted from San Francisco to have Corinne McSherry, who is the legal director of the Electronic Frontier Foundation and one of California's top entertainment lawyers in her prior life, perhaps her ongoing life as well. Nadine Elzein from Warwick University in the UK is also here with us, a philosopher and someone who has pondered the large aspects of our subject at hand, and Edward Hadas, who's a research fellow at Blackfriars Hall at Oxford and has worked in the past in finance and financial journalism and has some very interesting thoughts on the topic as well. I'd like us to begin by talking about censorship actually in a broader philosophical sense and trying to figure out just what we all mean when we say censorship and how we plug into that. And I thought we might start with Corinne McSherry to ask you, Corinne, if censorship has taken on a different meaning in the digital age.
Yes and no. I think that's right. I mean, we have a situation now where because of the internet and because all of the sort of communications technologies that we have an ability to communicate with more people than ever. I mean, you can send out a note and millions of people can read it. It's extraordinary, really. At the same time, we also have a situation where our communications, I mean, this isn't entirely new, but it's something that people lose track of. All of those communications, miraculous as they are, depend on service providers. And so there's sort of a chain of speech, and there's a whole lot of weak links in that speech. So, you know, I mean, in some countries, the internet is just shut down altogether, but short of that, a lot of us rely on social media platforms and they make decisions about what speech they're going to host and what speech they're not going to host. And that's not government censorship, but that nonetheless, you know, can have their decisions about what speech is bad and what speech is good, can have enormous consequences for our online conversations. And then of course there's all of the service providers that we don't really even think about, like domain name registrars who make decisions about what domains get to exist or not, what websites get to exist or not, and a million little service providers in between that we don't even think about. So we have a funny situation where we can communicate in miraculous ways more than ever before, and in some ways with more people than ever before. And at the same time, our communications are tremendously vulnerable.
Tremendous paradox at the heart of this question. Nadine, more people, you're on mute, by the way, you'll want to come off. More people with an opportunity to censor, as Corinne says, more ambiguities about standards in some ways. And it occurs to me sometimes that people just have an instinct to censor, to sort of avoid trouble, to think that it will be better if nobody says anything nasty, or if nothing is out there that might offend anybody. But that's not the world we live in these days, is it?
No, I mean, I think philosophers have traditionally worried about government censorship and traditional censorship of various media outlets, but nowadays the word is applied far more broadly, and I think people worry about all of the different avenues via which we can be censored. Now, of course, part of it is quite innocent. I think that often all people want is a kind of friendly, respectful conversation on various platforms, and I think that that's quite a reasonable thing to want. But like you say, it's not necessarily something that's easy to achieve, and people can get offended by quite a broad range of different things. I think it's an interesting question whether we should apply the same concerns about censorship to people simply putting social pressure on one another, or people worrying about debates in public, to the kind of way that we might think about censorship of a government towards traditional media. And I think we should probably distinguish censorship, which is there in order to protect people from abuse, from censorship that's there to back up power, or to control what people can find out about, or to basically get around criticism of the powerful, or certain interests or regimes. So, I mean, we can't live in a world where nobody says anything anyone else dislikes. So I think the interesting philosophical question is what the boundaries are for policing that in a way that respects our rights.
Gwen Robinson, thank you, Nadine. Gwen Robinson, you've got rich experience in Southeast Asia. You're at the heart of a region where there's plenty of controversy and trouble. And I don't know whether you think friendly, respectful conversation is possible in your part of the world, and how you think governments and private actors in that region are dealing with the threat of censorship.
Well, it's an interesting way to put it, Sandy. Yeah, of course, there are certain areas of conversation online in Southeast Asia that are friendly and respectful. But when you were kicked off with this broader issue of censorship and also self-censorship, I think in Southeast Asia, it's a particular case, which we're also seeing in some other parts of the world, but very, very strongly in Thailand. You've got this huge fear of draconian laws that govern any mention of the royals, and that can land you in jail for even the mildest form of criticism. So I think what we've seen, this is something that has, everyone just lives with in Thailand, which is that you self-censor as a result of fear that even a mild criticism can end up landing you in jail. But then there's other forms that we've seen very strongly in broad Asia and other parts of the world, which is the rise of hate speech on the internet. And I think that as well has created a vast wave of self-censorship, because people are just scared. Weekly in Myanmar, for example, you get people's names published with addresses, and so urging people to go and attack certain people, giving their details. So that, I think, also really is a dampener on free speech. And that's even before, I won't even begin to go into regulation in this region. So it's just to point out those other factors that are just there and you live with, and does, I think, shape media and the way they operate, and also just ordinary citizens commenting on the internet.
I think that's right. Edward, I think you have had particular concerns that in criticizing certain regimes, I mean, Vladimir Putin, for one, and his war in Ukraine, other places, the Chinese, whom we'll come to in just a few moments, you have some concerns that we're letting Western democracies off the hook sometimes, and sitting in judgment within Western democracies of others. You're on mute right now. You want to take it off before you answer my question.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. So I am interested in this as a problem. It seems to me that the way I would tend to start thinking about it is that the control of information and the setting the boundaries of information or of media communications of one sort or another is one of the things that all governments are concerned with. And if the whole issue of censorship develops as a kind of attempt to limit the power of governments. And at least since the 20th century, we have more and more powerful governments, often working, including in liberal democracies, often working very closely with, say, an establishment or a media. And so it seems pretty natural that you're going to have a fair amount of censorship, self-censorship, both government censorship, private sector censorship, self-censorship, say all three. And trying to figure out how to set those boundaries is going to be a challenge. And I don't think there's any reason to see liberal democracies as enormously different in kind. They face the same issues. We have the same kinds of debates. We have less censorship, and so we can have these debates more in the open. But the issue of what the role of helping people have a clear sense of what the truth is or what the story is one that I think all governments face, and indeed all societies face. If you're going to have any kind of social unity, you need to have some kind of control of the discourse, and that seems to me an issue. We need to think about how much control and who gets to have that control.
You mentioned the issue of looking for the truth, and of course, we all like to think that's what we're doing all the time. With the advent of social media, there's been much more conversation about whether falsehoods have the same protection of free speech as the truth. And we don't have to right this minute go into the reasons why this has become such a pressing question. But it is a very important question. Corinne, I should think that it's online where that is really tested daily, monthly, weekly, all the time, what's a lie and who's to say, and where is the line, if any, on whether it's protected or not. And you're on mute right now.
Well, legally, for the most part, false information is legally protected. So as a matter of, at least in the United States. So as a matter of First Amendment law, for the most part, it's a very, very, very high bar before a government can force speech offline. It's being tested quite a bit recently, as several states have decided to get into the social media regulation game, and we'll see what happens with our current Supreme Court on that. But under the current rules, for the most part, false information can in fact be put online, and the idea is that should and can be overwhelmed by correct information. I think the research has begun to suggest a couple different things, which one is that unfortunately false information does spread. It spreads, and particularly within certain communities where it aligns with one's bias already. So we have a sort of confirmation bias problem. false information can be spread and it can be difficult for some communities to recognize it as false, right? We don't have the situation we all want, which is that true information overwhelms the false information. There's also the one thing that gives me some hope is that we finally, I mean, really the research has lagged very far behind the rhetoric. And there is recent research that does suggest that, you know, there's a little less false information out there than you might think. And the people who believe it are fewer than you might think. They're just really loud. And
are we supposed to be happy about that?
Well, I think that we can have a sense that the internet is just this terrible cesspool of lies and confusion and falsehoods. And I actually just don't think that's true. I just think that there is a part of it that is that. But the internet is also an extraordinary vehicle for sharing truth. It's really important. It has changed the game that we can see videos of police shootings, that we can see, record and share videos of atrocities that are awful, But when people see it, it makes a difference, I think. And I mean, those are just a couple of examples. And also the internet is a place where actually you can spread good information, correct information, also quickly to millions of people. And that's really important. I just think it's very easy to lose sight of that bit. And I don't know that it's a censorship problem. It's just, it is just sort of I think we can have more hope than we currently do in the conversations about online speech. And we should.
Could I, do you think I could add to Corinne's
Yes,
point,
absolutely.
Sandy?
Please do, Gwen.
Actually, I totally agree on the double-edged nature of, but this is an old debate and quite controversial, but definitely in this region, for example, the wholesale destruction of independent media in Myanmar since the February 1st coup in 2021 saw, you know, lots of every independent organization either closed down, raided, journalists, you know, harassed, locked up in some cases. You know, any independent media has basically gone below ground. But what we've seen flourish is an extraordinary range of publications, really, all kinds of publications on social media. And they're able to do this with very little money and get the news out and very powerful information and images. And without social media, I think, you know, there really would be very little coming out of Myanmar. So I think in that case, that's a really powerful example of how social media can still provide, actually be a real force for good and positive aspects.
I hear that, and obviously that's been true in many countries, in other places as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
It doesn't take very much. It doesn't take much in the way of resources to get information out online, and on the other hand, we don't have always reliable filters to know what information, and we have people struggling with how to create those filters and not knowing exactly. I mean, ingenuity is not enough. There has to be some sort of backup to that ingenuity, and I think that's where things go awry. Nadine, do you want to add something here about the philosophical challenge of defending falsehood?
Yes,
as a right.
I mean, I'm quite influenced by the philosopher John Stuart Mill here, and he thought that the value of free speech was really something we should protect because it's part of a kind of truth-finding exercise. And his point is quite simple, which is that none of us are infallible, and if we have some entity controlling the flow of information, then what we might do is hamper our ability to reach closer to the truth. So his view is that the reason we should protect free speech, the value of it, was precisely so that you got public debate and conflicting viewpoints, and through that process, you would be more likely to arrive at true information. Now, I think the challenge that we have today is something that Mill himself would not have anticipated when it comes to internet sites being flooded with fake news stories, but also when it comes to internet sites being flooded with fake news stories that basically argue that all of the mainstream news sources are fake and try to undermine our ability to tell apart a good source of information from a bad source of information. And I think where it gets compounded is when you get echo chambers as well. People are selective, and the more they click on one kind of content, the more they're shown only that kind of content back. So it looks like, to some extent, what we've seen is forces that go against the trend that Mill was talking about when he thought it was very important to protect free speech. So I think the challenge, it seems, is how do we get the voices of truth actually directly countering the misinformation? I should also say that Mill was really concerned to protect people's sincere ability to express their opinions. So what he says might not protect deliberate misinformation in the same way. It seems like perhaps part of the problem is with the way in which things go viral, the way in which we are presented with more of what we click on, and perhaps with the lack of agreement about how we do independent fact checking and how people are presented with alternative views. So I would be interested in whether the rest of the panel, with Mill in thinking that the value of free speech is something to do with allowing conflicting opinions and getting close to the truth, or whether it's something else, because certainly, like Gwen described in Myanmar, it seems like this can be an incredibly powerful source of allowing people to give their own opinions. But once you're flooded with enough misinformation, it can also constitute a kind of censorship whereby it becomes more difficult for accurate information to be heard.
Right. Might I say, Nadine, you did about as good a job of summarizing Mill's point as I've ever heard, as somebody who grapples with this every term with my free speech classes. I think you've done a very good job doing it. But the question I would ask, and I would ask the other panelists on this point, is in our time, is there no limit? Is there no line? Is there no frontier? And Edward, I think that's something I'd like to direct to you. Is Mill's the Millian guarantee absolute with no exceptions? Are there to be no exceptions whatsoever?
Well, I think maybe the way to start answering that question is with a little bit of puzzlement, is that we seem to know what the truth is here. On the one hand, we have that free speech is because none of us know the truth. And then we've just been told about how we can identify misinformation. And there's someone who seems to know what is misinformation and what is false news. But actually, that's a lot of what the debate is. You have pretty much everyone censoring, saying, I don't want this, say Russia. That wouldn't be true of the lèse-majesté in Thailand, but it would be true of many of the efforts of the Turkish or the Chinese government, would be to say that they're protecting their people against false news, against sort of drug dealers of Western idealism that lead you to misery and depravity. And if we're the ones who can say, well, that's wrong, then we've completely violated Mill's principle. But I perhaps I'm a little more skeptical than Nadine is about the value of what Mill is saying, or perhaps the realism of it. I think we do need in communities dialogue, narratives that we can share. And one of the things that one can see in the US is that we have very polarized narratives. I want to agree very strongly with what Corinne said before, that the the internet has allowed polarized narratives to develop very quickly. I'm not sure she put it quite like that. So I'm thinking about the COVID-19, where the narrative of this sort of vaccine hesitancy, if you will, or COVID denier narrative, as it was called, developed with a lot of scientific background and very quickly and very efficiently on the internet in a way that would have been hard to imagine 100 years ago. So in that sense, I think the internet has been has definitely developed what's really good about free speech, which is the capacity to do, as Mill says, to argue with each other in effective ways to get close to it. But I feel a little bit in a minority here of one of panelists of say, well, wait, you just keep talking about misinformation and falsehoods as if we knew exactly what they were.
Well, a fair point. I want to take this.
Can I respond to that?
Sure, please do, Corinne.
Because I do think I was thinking as Nadine was talking that we have a bit of a tension, but where we might say, yes, conflicting opinions, people can talk to each other and that's how we get to the truth. And that's great. But I think with the COVID situation, at least in the United States, it's been difficult because it's like, well, but what about the stuff that's not a matter of opinion? What about the stuff that's just, science? And that can be wiggly a little bit, because like early on, for example, it was like, don't masks are a waste of time. And then that changed. So that can change a little bit, but it does feel like maybe there's a core of information that's just really is true. And that should be set somewhere else a little bit. I just wanted to say one more thing because I feel like I'm the lonely person here who wants to be hopeful, or maybe I'm not lonely, but Twitter last week published some research that showed that when they now have a thing on Twitter where if you just repost something without reading it, you can, a little button will come up and say, do you want to read this first? And 30% of the time, people do not, in fact, retweet when they see that, either because they don't have time to read it and they think, oh, maybe I should read it first. And so they just don't do it. Or they do, in fact, read it and realize that actually it's not true or whatever. But I have to say, like, that was amazing to me. Like, the little button made a big difference. And I think that's extraordinary. And I wish we had a lot more of that. That kind of, and I suppose it's self-censorship, but I think it's as of people just being sensible and deciding, how do I want to contribute to the conversation? And how do I maybe want to avoid spreading information that either I don't know whether it's true or not, or it might just not be true.
Well, that's a very interesting, very, very, very interesting point. I'd like to take this conversation to China and ask.
They're not going to listen there, I'm afraid, but you can take it.
You never know. I once ran the Voice of America, Edward, and we had people listening in places where they said no one was ever able to listen. It was completely blocked out. And lo and behold, we would hear from them. By the way, before we go any further, for the participants in this, the audience, please remember to put your questions, any questions you have, in the Q&A, so that we can get to them in about 15, 20 minutes. Gwen, I'd like to take this conversation to China. And there are some, not just what the Chinese government says it wants its people to hear or allow its people to hear. And once again, this year on the anniversary of Tiananmen Square, it seems as if it didn't happen, although many of us saw it happening at the time. There's a pretty blatant case of internal censorship, but the Chinese have also managed, because of their vast commercial power in the world today, to get others to censor on their behalf. And one thing I think of are films from the United States and elsewhere that the Chinese tell the distributors they're going to have to change that. You're going to have to give them either happier endings or more acceptable endings or less upsetting things along the way if they want to exhibit them in China where they will have great profits. And it seems that in most cases that we know about, the filmmakers go along with these Chinese requests, or at least in many cases, they go along with them. And so that's a kind of collaboration between an authoritarian regime and various, not necessarily governments, but private commerce going along with the Chinese. And how do we, what do we make of that?
Well, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I think some of my fellow panelists would have strong views on this as well. But first of all, I think we've got to define the different imperatives behind the infamous spread of Chinese influence on censorship on the internet, and also generally in discussions of topics that yank Beijing's chain. I think, though, that there was a lot when there was a big rise of Chinese investment in, commercial influence in Hollywood,
Right.
and then going out to the world, lots more commercial influence in areas that touched on things like media and film entertainment. So I think we all read those stories. It was in the sort of late, the 2010s, first decade of 2000s. And I think so now we've got sort of the commercial aspect, where that's a very powerful form of pressure to censor. And I think that's one element. And the other one, obviously, is the political one, where there's so much influence, all kinds of strings and levers behind the scene that China can bring to bear. I mean, I do think that this happens in other regions of the world, but China is, of course, particularly notorious for it. And you can see the ways it works in, for example, this region where China really is extremely influential. It buys a lot of journalists, courts journalists, it gives free information services to media. It takes media all the time, invites them to China, showers them with largesse. So that's the form of soft power influence. So I think you've got several strands of the way Chinese influence plays out on both the internet and popular culture, and as I think you mentioned, film. So what are you asking? What should be done about it?
Yes, that's really what I'm asking, is whether the democratic countries upon whom this is being perpetrated, in not directly on the government, but on the societies, have any recourse to strike back. I mean, in sports, for example, the same thing has happened. It's happened in Europe, it's happened in the United States, where someone criticizes the Chinese for their treatment of the Uyghurs or something else, or in Hong Kong, and China simply says, well, we won't show your basketball games anymore. And,
Exactly.
and therefore has a huge capacity to affect the commercial success of American basketball.
Of course. And I think the most famous cases are things like Bloomberg in China, and also Google, big companies making compromises. And that you're bringing in, I think that's the commercial imperative, right? China is using its economic clout.
Yes.
And what you do about that, I think, is it's a very complex debate, because what do you do about enormous economic power and threats to block market access? That's a totally different issue to what you do about political threats, which I think are also, there's a lot of fear, for example, in this region about what, China's, incurring the wrath of China can actually cut a country off lucrative trade streams and things. I suppose that comes down to the economic imperative, but I think it also influences policies. So you actually get governments in this region, for example, maybe watching out for China's interests as well. And that's not just, there's commercial influence behind China's influence over those governments, but then I think it trickles down to the within a country, like for example in Thailand. I think there's a lot of Chinese interest in what the media, how the media portrays China.
I'm sure
So,
that's right.
yeah, so I'd probably leave it there and let I think I'm sure others have a strong view.
Yes. Well, I would be interested in other people's views of this. What recourse do Western democratic societies in particular have to fight against that kind of state censorship by the Chinese, or the threat of censorship, as a way to keep people in check about what they say about China? Any thoughts about that?
Yeah,
Edward?
I'll throw in the answer. I'm afraid, in my view, is not very much. You can make a decision that you will stand on principle, and I'm always in favor of standing on principles, particularly the ones I agree with. But the and so the NBA could have said, well, we'd rather give up on Chinese broadcasting rights than go along with this, and that would be, I'd be admirable. Whether it would have much effect on China is hard to say, but I think Gwen just went through a very potent case. The Chinese care. They have a lot of economic power. A lot of the people don't really care that much about the particular issues. A lot of people say in Thailand or Myanmar or India, or indeed the United States, basically feel the way that the Chinese government should do what it wants in China. And so you would to try and gain righteous indignation against this and the willingness to make sacrifices for this cause, I think is going to be an uphill struggle. So I would feel, I find it very hard to see what in practice democratic countries could do, except perhaps to make a stronger effort to be beacons of freedom and free speech themselves.
Well, I'm always in favor of that, I must say.
Right.
But the irony there, I to my mind, is that we are in a moment, at least with respect to social media, where particularly at the state level, but also at the federal level, there's the techlash, right? And everyone hates big tech, and everyone thinks what we need to do is figure out how to regulate it more. And some of the proposals some of them are still just proposals, some of them have actually been enacted, will be terrible for online speech and actually undermine online speech in a whole bunch of different ways. But I think there's many policymakers who strongly believe, or at least will say they believe for purposes of, rhetoric, that, it's long past time to rein in the social media platforms. And that usually means regulating speech. I think there's more appetite for that in the United States than I have seen in my lifetime. Fortunately, there's lots of other people who disagree, but there is a strong appetite for it here.
Corinne, it sounded to me like you were advocating just that a few minutes ago. You were talking.
No.
We had to stop people from telling falsehoods.
No. I think what we need to do is encourage people's ability, users' ability to make their own decisions. I want to put users in the driving seat. Well, I worry a lot about any situation where you either have a government or you have a small group of unaccountable companies making decisions about what speech is good and what speech is not. They have the right to do that. I will protect their right to do that legally. And I think we should, and I think that's right. But really what I think the world we want is a world in which the individual people are able to have more power to speak, not speak, decide, not decide, filter their own internet experience, rather than having either a government or a few companies do it for them.
Nadine, you have a unique opportunity at the moment to play the philosopher royal on this matter.
I mean, I do want to say something. I think it relates to exactly what Corinne is saying here. And I think in response to what Edward said earlier, it's one thing to say that we think there's lots of fake news out there. It's another thing to say, I know exactly what's true and what's false, and my own opinion on this is absolute. The way in which I think things get worrying is where you get more of whatever you click on, and people are forced into echo chambers so that they don't exactly get what you're doing with. When the dynamic is like this, is undermining people's ability to be confronted with opposing opinions. And at least part of the stuff that Corinne, I think, is talking about isn't about shutting down people giving opinions, but things like the button that just makes people actually think about whether they've read what they're posting and really agree with it. And then I think things like, you know, changing the way that algorithms work so that perhaps we are presented with opposing viewpoints. And although I don't think any of us has infallible access to the truth, there's certainly means of fact checking. I think the important thing is that they are independent and that they're not just driven by the agenda of one company or one government, and that, you know, the process is transparent in some way. So I think that is subtly different to just shutting down what you take to be misinformation.
On that fact-checking point, I just want to make two remarks here. One is that, of course, fact-checking takes much longer than telling lies. And it can be a very difficult business. The other thing is that there are actually some American state legislatures that are passing laws in the states, not the federal government, regulating fact-checking, which is like the ultimate punishment here for trying to do something good. But whether they have to have licenses or whether they have to prove their credentials to be fact checkers. And of course, this is a political thing because they don't want their facts checked. They only want other people's facts checked. And so that is a very serious problem. And the forces of evil have thought of a new way to deal with it that is very worrisome. But lastly, Nadine, what about this issue of Western democratic governments who are imbued by the spirit of John Stuart Mill in many, if not all cases? What is their recourse when institutions, commercial institutions, under their influence, under their control in some respects, under their authority, are cooperating with censorship, with a disruption of creativity in the name of the Chinese commercial market, or in Chinese feelings? How do you resolve that?
You know, unfortunately, I think I share some of Edward's pessimism here about whether there is very much that governments can do. I mean, the problem is companies have a very big profit incentive, and it's very difficult to get companies driven by profit to choose to basically embrace values that can counteract their profits. I don't see any way that it's easily going to happen unless you have legislation that explicitly stops them from doing this kind of business in China, and I think that would create problems too. I think we also have to worry about how far we want to stop businesses from cooperating with regimes we don't like very much, because it will also inevitably lead to further isolation between different nations. And I'm not sure there are any easy solutions here that won't have repercussions which are similarly difficult.
Corinne, do you have any thoughts on that point before we go to Mike Scott and ask him to present us with some of the questions that have come in from our listeners, from our participants?
I have two thoughts. One is, yes, I actually don't think there's all that much that Western democracies, or certainly Western democratic governments, can do. I do know that there have been movements on the part of company employees to try to force their
Good point.
bosses to do something different with mixed success, I think very mixed long-term success. There have been some short-term successes, and then over the long term, profit is profit. That is a reality. The other thought I do have, and I think I want to echo part of what Nadine was saying, I do think we do need to pay attention and be really careful about isolating countries. I think this is one of the things that we've seen in the war in Ukraine, a big push on the part of a bunch of Western democracies to tell companies to cut off a country up and down the internet stack. And I think that, and some of those companies fortunately, pushed back, and I think rightly so, because the last thing I think we want right now is for people in Russia to have no sources of factual information, whether they believe it or not. You want it to be available for people as much as possible. And so, that was something I found very worrisome. Understandable, right? People act, it's a moment of crisis, but Western democracies demanding, internet shutdowns for a country that they don't like, I think was something that inevitably was going to backfire and will backfire and is already backfiring. The best thing that I think, a thing that Vladimir Putin would like more than anything would be to have total control over all information that's available to people in Russia.
I thank you for that point. I think that's a very, very interesting part of this conversation that we have to look out for. Mike Scott, do you have some questions to present from our audience across the various parts of the world that might be listening?
I think actually, Sandy, you've censored them because I haven't got any. But I've got some issues that I'd like to just take up. I mean, it's and if anybody can send some questions in, please do so. But we've had a silence today.
Can I just say, I think there's like 12 questions there.
I see 12 in the Q&A. Logan has perhaps
Logan
passed
hasn't
them
passed them on to me. Right. Okay. Let's see what we're going to get with the Q&A box. Okay. Angela Preston. Pornography is one on a free speech argument. Research shows pornography watching reduces empathy towards women because of the high incidence of violence against women, 88%. Would the world be better if government censored pornography, since 13% of web searches and 20% of mobile searches are pornography? Over to you. Who wants to take that one first?
I'll take that. I have to say, I have to go in a minute. I have another obligation, so I'll just say something very, very briefly here. As I think, and this gets back to my first point, is I think censorship is inevitable. It's, John Stuart Mill has a principle, but I'm not sure it's a realistic principle or even necessarily always a good one. And pornography used to be banned more or less effectively. And then the social consensus on the badness and goodness of pornography changed. And I don't see why it couldn't change again if we accept the questioner's judgment as its bad effect, or the studies that she's citing. But I think that we are going to say, well, we're just never going to censor anything isn't a very realistic thing to say. The question is, under what circumstances, how do you promote the good that Mill suggests we have in free speech? And I think that's a legitimate, important debate to have. But I think to say, well, the only answer is to have no censorship is just very unrealistic and probably wrong, because there are very many vulnerable people who need to be protected from, if you will, false or in this case, damaging content. So I think there is a legitimate case to be made in any case against for the censorship of pornography. And at that, I'm afraid I must go. So I will let people disagree with me in absentia. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward.
Can I respond to that? So I'm going to do the thing that my law professors forbade me from doing, but I'm doing it anyway. I'm going to fight the hypo. As a practical matter, voluntarily, companies intervene to censor pornography all the time. Most of the social media platforms, their terms of service forbids most form of pornography. And so, they regularly take down sexual imagery. I mean, actually, to be honest with you, that's can also be a problem because they're not particularly good at drawing a line between an image of a woman breastfeeding and something that's actually porn. So that's also a problem. Universally, companies act quite aggressively to take down child images as much as possible. They're not perfect and they make mistakes, but they work really hard against that. So to be honest with you, I mean, I'm not saying, obviously, the internet is for porn was a cliche early on, but it is nonetheless true that with respect to many, many platforms, there's quite aggressive efforts to censor pornography. Now, there's still pornography sites, and those exist. And so I suppose if the concern is, well, we need to shut those sites down altogether, that's not something I would agree with. But I just want to sort of point out that there's a lot of that intervention already happening. And people may not realize that, but that is the reality.
Okay, thanks for that. I've got a question from Emma Vahi. What do the panelists think about the argument that the scientific method is comparable to J.S. Mill's argument about seeking the truth in society via free speech, i.e., seeking scientific truth via the scientific method? And Emma's saying she's thinking about this in terms of the evolution of COVID information and findings. Nadine, will you want to have a go at that?
So, yeah, I mean, I think that ideally the way that scientists practice, you do have argument and counter argument, and you have a lot of transparency, and you have a lot of different viewpoints which are being heard. I'd be reluctant to therefore say that we can favour scientific consensus over all opposed opinions. And certainly I think that Mill would be sceptical about doing that because it would still seem to involve some claim to infallibility. But of course, there are limits. I think that the scientific method has established some things in pretty concrete terms, and we are able to at least not just say that anyone's opinion is as good as anyone else's, no matter what kind of evidence backs up one of those opinions, and no matter whether the other one is just completely made up on the spot. So I do think that the process, ideally in science, is similar. I suppose I think we should at least take into account what the scientific process has taught us when we're thinking about how to independently fact check. I don't think that this replaces the process of public discussion that Mill was talking about, because of course there are dissenting voices within scientific communities too.
Can I just add to that, if you don't mind, Michael?
Yes, Gwen, yeah.
I think your point is really interesting, but I'd like to take it a step further as a journalist and say that I think the COVID pandemic was a real it was a game changer for journalism worldwide, I think, because suddenly it was of such magnitude, such a crisis, and there was so much need and thirst for information. And for journalists who were not, actually in hindsight, you might think that media should have maybe put journalists into training, some crash course in scientific principles, but suddenly there was such demand that you had a lot of journalists who'd never written a science story or on medical issues, quoting scientists or doctors. And of course, we have had a whole range of medical views. And so I think particularly in the first year of COVID, you had so much, what about ranging from the US president urging people to drink whatever it was, some ridiculous thing, to, every second quack claiming to have a special cure, which actually became dangerous when people were, and it was reported as fact. But what you had was reporters reporting as fact what some supposed expert was saying. And also the explosion of the urgency, I think, actually stymied normal fact-checking processes. Maybe, you know, you had articles churning through every minute of every day for like maybe at least 6 months. So that really highlighted some of the issues you're talking about now. And I mean, I'm applying the term scientific literally, but I think that is a real example really of some urgent crisis where there was such need. And I think that's happening in other fields as well, like climate change, you know, between deniers and advocates, and a lot of straight reporting by journalists who may not be experts, but often you do not have time to go into deep fact checking. So that's really just wanted to put that out there about how it plays out when it actually comes down to media and these sort of issues.
Thanks for that. One for Corinne, I think, coming here from Karen Kugels. The problem is, says Karen, the problem is when the principles of democracy and human rights smack up against capitalism and profits. The US has not always been a beacon of light in how it has acted in other countries. I believe education on biases and how to identify truth is important. It should begin in our school systems. Corinne, what do you say to that?
100%, completely to all of that. I think that I mean, if you look at the history of Latin America alone, you know, the United States bears a lot of responsibility that it does not like to admit to in terms of, you know, the development of democracy. We have not always been a beacon of light by any means. So I agree with that. And absolutely, our people need to learn more about confirmation bias. They need to understand, people need to learn more about statistics. This is all true. I mean, I don't think we're going to educate our way out of this, but I do think that it should certainly begin there. And I say that knowing at the same time that unfortunately in the United States, there are a lot of state legislators who are working very hard to make sure that American students anyway don't get good education, don't get access to truth, unfortunately. But nonetheless, that, you know, that's not what it should be. And so yes, media literacy, right? This is basic. It is a necessary but not sufficient condition. I think of media literacy plus user tools so that you can actually do something with that information. You need both of those things.
Well, thanks for that. And Maria, Jose Pereira Rosso says, and how should content moderation and the media account for cultural differences and different cultural sensitivities? Mm. Who wants to take that one? Gwen?
Well, I think that's sort of like, that's a question that's haunted everybody, and particularly media, from the moment I think social media or even the internet was invented, you know, taking into account, I mean, the internet has globalized everything, but including also, you know, the media and particularly opinion articles, things like that. And there is no, I mean, I think there's an implication that there could be a one size fits all and you can avoid offending, you know, myriad constituencies, and you can't. So I guess we're back to that broader debate about internet, well, not just internet, but censorship, and how far do you censor for, you know, these cultural sensitivities, and that's beyond hate speech. And I have no answer to that except to say that I think that there is a common set of agreed red lines, including hate speech, you know, calling for violence, things like that. Once it goes beyond that to specific constituencies and offending people over certain things, you know, it's almost impossible to come up with a formula. And I think every day there's some grievous offence committed on offending people through media, particularly.
Mike, may I cut in here for just a moment?
Yes, please.
Okay, I was asking my colleague Mike if
Oh.
he objects.
Oh, I
Yeah,
thought
yeah,
you meant
yeah.
you were cutting in on me.
Yeah, you
I'd
can.
finished.
I'm
Go
just
on,
being,
yeah.
I'm being overly polite. Gwen, I wanted to put this further question to you that don't you have a sense that the job of a journalist, and especially an international journalist, has been just impossibly complicated by some of these issues? And I think of some of my times functioning as a foreign correspondent of sorts in simpler times, that we could sort of decide how to pursue something without worrying, without having, when I worked for a wire service, there wasn't time to consult subtleties of opinions or whether somebody might be offended or not. And it's made it in times when so many things are uncertain. And I think your example of the COVID confusion is a perfect one. It's just made it a very, very difficult thing. And as a result, journalists are sometimes choosing points of view without even realizing it.
Well, I totally agree. I think that's well put. And also beyond that, the COVID case was a particular type of example, but I think that question highlights what I think is one of the biggest. We started by talking about self-censorship, and I think this reinforces a self-censorship too, which is even when if I go to write an opinion piece, I'm now thinking about, myriad sectors or types of people who might be offended, and I feel, you feel so inhibited, and I think that also creates its own form of self-censorship. Am I offending someone? Will I appear politically incorrect? And you just wish you could just go ahead and write something, but then you stand by and see somebody who's absolutely crucified. And we've seen very famous examples, particularly in America, of careers ruined by this sort of thing. So I think, generally it has shaped and acted as I think a dampener on media, sometimes to good effect. And, obviously there is a very positive side to that, but there's also a negative side, which is, I think it's watered down the opinion industry a lot. And it has actually benefited some of the more thick-skinned and some might say boneheaded people who don't care, who are fine to say something offensive. And actually, if you look, often offensive articles traffic very well. I mean, people like to read strong opinions, and they also like to read people that anger them. So there's actually, I think, some lesson there is that sometimes it's possibly not a bad thing to offend people and speak out, but you just have to recognize those red lines where it goes beyond just, merely ruffling someone's feathers to actually, seriously insulting, offending, or worse.
I mean, there's people who've made entire careers out of offending people.
That's right.
That's
I could name 20, but I won't.
Yeah.
I think they're called politicians, aren't they? But never mind.
No, there's plenty
There's
of
a
them.
question. There's a question in from Kinga Ranagavai. Hi, Kinga. It seems to me, says Kinga, that the problem, albeit real, is less the censoring of the public and more one of the total lack of sanction on those yielding official power who make maliciously false utterances. Would it be a solution to restrict First Amendment rights to a personal right that cannot be extended to utterances made in an official capacity? Corinne, you better take that one.
So
Can we define utterance?
I want to make sure I understand their proposal. So the idea is that individuals get First Amendment protections, but public officials do not.
I think that's
And
what she's saying, yes.
I think that the sanction that is envisioned in most democratic contexts is the vote. You can vote people out, and that's what you do. Now, I think that is an imperfect answer. I understand that, that's, the state of the United States right now is not looking very good for democracy in many respects. So I understand that is an unsatisfactory answer, but I think it is a better answer than this proposal. I will say, there are sanctions against public officials that exist. We do think a little bit differently about speech of individuals who are non-public individuals and speech of public officials. And there's actually more protections, for example, for criticizing public officials, public figures. So we do, build in some distinctions there. But it's also not always going to be a super easy line to draw. People can become public figures overnight. Doesn't mean they're elected public figures, but they can become powerful public figures quite quickly. And I wouldn't like to try to litigate the case that figured out when that line got crossed in a fast moving situation.
That was an interesting answer in relation to what's happening in the UK today, because there's a vote of confidence or no confidence in Boris Johnson tonight for misleading Parliament.
Right, so there you go. You have a sanction right there.
Paul Williams asks, regardless of whether facts, balanced arguments, etc., are available on various platforms, isn't there a fundamental problem that we as readers choose to look at those articles, commentators, platforms that conform to our own views? Nadine, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so I think this is a really serious problem. And I think that this is one which is slightly compounded by social media, where people can just get more of what they click on, and where we can basically actively seek out news sources which confirm our own biases. I don't know what we can do about that. I mean, even before the internet, obviously you will buy the newspaper that you choose to buy, and you're going to be only confronted to some extent with opinions that you seek out. I suppose one thing I would hope is that maybe in the future we can work out ways in which to stop social media turning into very restrictive echo chambers. Maybe there would be some way in future for technology not to inevitably lead us all to be trapped inside a bubble where we only have our own biases and our own opinions fed back to us. But Corinne will probably be better placed than me to comment on whether that's ever going to be a realistic possibility.
Yeah.
Anybody else on that?
I mean, I do think that we have that reality. We have people choosing to silo themselves. And by the way, I do think, at least in the United States, one of the, the elephant in the room, we've been focusing a lot on internet speech, but really we should be talking about Fox News. If you want to know what the media outlet that is the most influential in the United States and on US politics, it's probably Fox News. It's TV. Also MSNBC, for that matter. My own father, he has MSNBC on all day long, just like some people have Fox News on all day long. And I don't think that there's a lot that we can do about that. People are going to make those choices. Used to be talk radio. People would listen to Rush Limbaugh all day long. And the whole point of Rush Limbaugh was for people to agree with each other and agree with him. People would just call in just to agree with him. That was the entire point. This is a thing that we do. I would suggest, though, this is me just calling back to my old life as a media scholar, this is not an entirely new phenomenon. We're just seeing it on a global scale. People have been, choosing the newspaper that confirmed their political viewpoint. People used to make newspaper choices based on their political party. It's not an entirely new phenomenon. It's a thing that humans do. And I think maybe we just sort of try to hope that over time, we at least get some of the right information, into that silo.
There's one question. I'm going to finish with this one, and then I'll come to Sandy again. But I think I ought to ask it to Corinne and Nadine, because Karen Cougar's come back and she said, Corinne and Nadine sound as though they believe that profit wins over social consciousness. It doesn't have to. Companies can make less profit for the good of the community, and many do. She goes on, but we haven't got much time.
Yeah.
Corinne?
Yeah, they sure can. I absolutely. And one of the things that I think is really important to create space for is the existence of alternative platforms. It's really important that we don't set up a situation where, you know, Facebook is always the dominant choice and people don't have the ability to choose other social media platforms that maybe make different choices that they want and respect. Currently, though, the good news is there are lots and lots of different places that you can go for information, but you have to make a little bit more effort to do it. So I think if we want companies to have a social consciousness, we have to vote with our feet, we have to vote with our eyeballs, and make different choices ourselves.
Last word from Nadine and then from Gwen. Nadine?
So I absolutely agree that it's going to require the rest of us to have a conscience and to think about which companies we invest in and which companies we're willing to engage with. I think part of the problem here is that it's possible for companies to ignore profits and instead act with some sense of moral conscience. The question is whether it's likely. Certainly not a kind of inevitability that the free market will deliver the best of all possible worlds. It often doesn't, and a sort of Panglossian attitude about these things, I think, would be out of place, but that doesn't mean that there aren't ways in which to counter the influence of profit, and we should certainly think about that as consumers. Yes.
Gwen, any further comment?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure if the questioner, and I appreciate her provocative questions, but whether she's suggesting there is a better way here. But I would say that I think in this modern day and age, and with so many, it's not like it was before. The internet has made a huge difference, and I think you really have to be a bit more realistic and say that, of course, profit is one of the main bottom lines, and ideally regulation is supposed to bring in or try and bring in line and curb some of the excesses, and that applies to everything from straight corporate culture to media, and in some up to an extent that works better in the West than I think it does in Asia. But you know, obviously, all I can conclude is there's a long way to go, and it's evolving, I think, as we still see it. And debates like the kind of debate we're having tonight, I think this all feeds in to over the time do improve things. I mean, whoever would have thought that Facebook, the behemoth, has come under so much pressure in the last 5 years, whereas in those first wild years, there was no notion of regulating these things. So I just
thank you for that. To give Karen her due, she did give an example of the huge profits of energy companies that they're making now, and those soaring prices, which she says could be taxed, which actually has just happened in the UK. There was
I think we can thank Vladimir Putin for that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Sandy, is there anything else you want to?
No, I think we've had a very wide-ranging conversation, a good one. I think we went down some pathways we didn't necessarily expect to, and I think that's owing to the diversity of the people who are part of the discussion today. I want to thank everybody for your participation, Nadine, Gwen, Corinne, in absentia, Edward, and I especially want to thank Logan Richmond, our principal research assistant at the Free Speech Project, for stepping in at the very last moment to help manage today's conversation and doing a great job. And thank all the supporting people at Georgetown University who helped make this series possible. And salute to Mike Scott, my partner over more than a year and a half now in bringing these dialogues to life and having a great time doing it. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Yes, let me give
Bye.
those thanks as well. Can I just say the next free speech project of the Crossroads International Dialogues event in association with the Future Humanities Project will be on Monday, the 11th of July, when we'll be discussing whistleblowing. Again, my thanks to the people at Georgetown, my thanks to the people at Oxford, at Campion Hall, Nick Austin, and Sarah Gray, and Ying Ying, and good luck, Sarah, because she retires at the end of this term. So we wish you well, and thank you very much. Thanks to Logan for coming in when we had a bit of a problem today, and his help. Thank you for Laura Lees, who's been helping me, and Maggie Scott, my wife, who helps me to put all this together. Thanks to everybody who's asked questions. If they weren't answered, we're very sorry, but we will, if necessary, try to email answers to you. And thank you, everybody, for attending today. I'm Mike Scott, Fellow and Senior Dean at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. You can follow me on Twitter at Mike Scott Prof. Thanks also to Sandy. Thanks to everybody else. Until next time, take care, keep safe, and goodbye. Bye-bye.
Thanks, all.
All right.
Bye-bye.